July 10, 1943. The beaches of Sicily. American Sherman tanks roll off landing ships onto foreign soil. The invasion of Europe has begun. 232 tanks. Thousands of soldiers. One mission: push the Germans out of Sicily and end the war faster. But within hours, something impossible starts happening. Tanks begin breaking down, not from enemy fire, not from battle damage. They just stop. Right in the middle of combat. Engines running, crews panicking. The machines simply refuse to move. By noon, 7 tanks are dead. By evening, 38 tanks are combat losses, not a single one hit by German weapons. The mechanics are baffled. The commanders are furious. The Germans are winning battles they should be losing. And nobody knows why. Nobody realizes that 4 months earlier, in a small office in Georgia, a tired woman made a $5 typing mistake. One missing zero on a piece of paper. 5 units instead of 500. That mistake is about to change World War II. This is the true story of how the smallest error became the biggest disaster, and how 99 American tanks went to war without the parts they needed to survive. Let's go back, 4 months before Sicily, before the invasion, before everything fell apart. Fort Benning, Georgia. 6:30 in the morning. The sun hasn't fully risen yet, but the lights are already on in Quartermaster Building 7. Margaret Sullivan walks through the door exactly 30 minutes early. She's 23 years old, graduated secretarial school in Atlanta last year. Got hired by the Army because every man who could hold a rifle was overseas fighting and someone needed to process the paperwork that kept them supplied. Margaret is good at her job. Top 10% of her typing class. Makes fewer mistakes than most of her colleagues. But today is March 15th, and today she's about to make a mistake that will kill people she'll never meet. She doesn't know that yet. Nobody does. The office is massive. 48 desks arranged in perfect rows. 48 typewriters. 48 wire baskets overflowing with forms that need processing. The room smells like coffee and paper and that distinctive odor of manual typewriters, ink and oil and worn ribbon. Margaret sits at her desk in the northeast corner. Same desk she sat at for 8 months. She organizes her workspace with automatic precision. Pencils on the right, forms in the inbox on the left, carbon paper stacked neatly in the middle, everything in its place because chaos is the enemy of accuracy. 7 o'clock sharp, Captain Harold Matthews begins distributing work assignments. He's 42 years old. Too old to fight. Too asthmatic to pass a physical. But 15 years as a corporate accountant made him perfect for military logistics. He manages this clerical pool like a machine. Efficiency, accuracy, speed, in that exact order. He calls out names, hands out stacks of forms. Each clerk receives their daily quota of procurement orders that need typing. Margaret receives orders numbered 47,800 through 47,867. 68 separate orders. Equipment for the 2nd Armored Division, hell on wheels. Currently training at Fort Hood, Texas. Preparing to deploy overseas. Preparing to fight Germans in North Africa. The 2nd Armored Division needs everything: tanks, trucks, ammunition, radios, medical supplies, food, uniforms, 10,000 different items that have to be ordered from manufacturers, shipped to depots, organized into load plans, and delivered to the right units at the right time. Margaret's job is simple: take handwritten requisition requests, type them into official procurement orders. Send those orders to manufacturers who will make the stuff and ship it to the Army. Simple, repetitive. Mind-numbing after 8 months of doing it 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. But necessary. Because modern war runs on paperwork. Every bullet, every bandage, every tank part. It all starts with someone like Margaret typing numbers into forms that become orders, that become physical objects that soldiers use to stay alive. She begins working through her stack. 1 form at a time, read the handwritten request. Type the information into the official order, check for errors. Move to the next form. Form 47,800. Tank tracks, Form 47,801. Engine filters, Form 47,802. Radio equipment. The morning passes. The pile of completed forms in her outbox grows. The pile of unprocessed forms in her inbox shrinks. By 9 o'clock, Margaret has processed 15 forms. By 10:30, she's done 32. She's making good time, staying ahead of quota. If she maintains this pace, she'll finish by 5 o'clock instead of working late into the evening like yesterday and the day before and every day last week. But staying ahead of quota requires speed, and speed requires that your fingers move faster than conscious thought. Muscle memory takes over. Your brain stops consciously processing every keystroke. Your hands just type automatically, like a pianist playing a piece they've performed 10,000 times. At 11:47 in the morning, Margaret reaches procurement order 47,829. The form is thick, 283 line items, miscellaneous tank components for Sherman tanks. Everything from transmission gears to periscope glass. She's been typing for 4 hours straight. Her shoulders ache, her eyes burn, her fingers are developing the kind of repetitive strain that will plague her for the rest of her life. But she keeps typing, because there's a war on, because boys are dying, because someone has to process these forms, and if she doesn't do it, who will? Line item 45, transmission gears. Line item 46, engine gaskets. Line item 47, steel roller bearings, type 4, heavy duty. Her tired eyes read the handwritten quantity, 500 units. Her tired brain processes the information, 500. Her tired fingers move to type, 500. But that last zero key doesn't fully depress. Her pinky finger is weaker than the other fingers. After 4 hours of typing, it's getting tired. The key pushes down maybe 6 millimeters instead of the required 8. The type bar rises, but it doesn't quite reach the ribbon. No impression transfers to the paper beneath. The zero that should appear simply doesn't exist. 5 units instead of 500. Margaret doesn't notice. Her attention has already moved to line item 48. Her hands keep typing. The machine keeps working. The error has been made. It exists now, written into official documents. About to propagate through the machinery of war with consequences that nobody can predict. Captain Matthews reviews Margaret's completed forms at 1:15 that afternoon. He spends approximately 90 seconds per form. His review process is designed to catch obvious errors, missing signatures, incorrect calculations, something that jumps out as clearly wrong. He reviews procurement order 47,829, 283 line items. Total value $480,000. That's nearly $500,000 in 1943 money, equivalent to about $8 million today. His eyes scan down the form. Line item 47 reads, steel roller bearings, type 4, heavy duty, 5 units, price per unit $47.50. Total $237.50. Nothing about this seems wrong. Some line items order thousands of parts, others order dozens, some order single units for specialized equipment. 5 bearings? Sure. That fits within the normal range of variation Matthews sees every day. He signs the form with his approval stamp, places it in the outbox for the contracts office, moves on to the next form. The error has passed its first checkpoint. The contracts office receives the approved procurement order that afternoon. A contracts officer matches it against existing agreements between the Army and manufacturers. The Timken Roller Bearing Company in Canton, Ohio, holds the contract for military bearings. The officer stamps the procurement order with Timken's contract number, calculates delivery schedules, forwards the order via telegram to Timken's military liaison office. At Timken's factory in Canton, production supervisor George Hendricks receives the order on March 17th. He's 56 years old, worked at Timken for 32 years. Knows roller bearings better than he knows his own children. Type 4 heavy-duty bearings are substantial components, 6 inches diameter, 4 inches wide, made from hardened steel with precision tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Manufacturing each bearing requires about 8 hours of machine time plus inspection and finishing. Normal military orders run from 500 to 2,000 units depending on the application. An order for 5 units strikes Hendricks as unusual, but not impossible. Maybe it's a test batch, maybe replacement inventory. Maybe some officer needs a small quantity for reasons that aren't Hendrix's problem. His job, manufacture what the army orders, not question why they order it. He schedules production of 5 bearings for completion by March 25th, allocates 40 hours of machine time, moves to the next order. The 5 bearings are manufactured perfectly, pass quality inspection with flying colors, get packed in heavy wooden crates with proper documentation, ship via rail freight to Red River Arsenal, Texas on March 26th. At Red River Arsenal, Supply Sergeant Thomas Bradley processes the incoming shipment according to standard procedure. Unload crates, check documentation, log items into inventory, store crates in appropriate warehouse locations. The wooden crate containing 5 bearings gets assigned to Warehouse 14, Row 7, Shelf C, Position 23. It sits there, waiting. Nobody realizes that 495 additional bearings are missing from the system. Nobody knows to look for them. The error is invisible because it exists as an absence. Meanwhile, the 2nd Armored Division continues training at Fort Hood. Commanders assume they're fully equipped. Supply officers believe all necessary parts have been ordered. Maintenance crews trust that replacement components will be available when needed. Everyone is wrong, but nobody knows it yet. The 2nd Armored Division trains hard, brutal, relentless training designed to simulate combat conditions. Because Major General Ernest Harmon believes that the only training that matters is training that exceeds the stress of actual warfare. The division has 232 M4 Sherman tanks, organized into 3 battalions. Each battalion has 54 tanks, divided into 3 companies. The Shermans are good tanks, not the best. German Panthers and Tigers are better, but Shermans can be produced in quantities that German industry can't match. Each Sherman needs about 18,000 individual parts to function. The final drive assembly, the gearbox that transfers engine power to the tracks, is critical. It operates under enormous torque, sustains constant vibration from the main gun firing, gets punished by hard driving across rough terrain. The Type 4 heavy-duty roller bearings inside that final drive are specifically designed to handle those stresses. Proper bearings should last at least 2,000 hours of combat operation. That's weeks or months of actual combat before they need replacement. But proper bearings have to exist first, and for 99 tanks in the 2nd Armored Division, they don't. Late April, tank crews are conducting final equipment checks before deploying overseas. Every system gets inspected according to detailed checklists. Engines tested under load, transmissions cycled through all gears, weapons bore-sighted and test-fired. Everything that can be checked must be checked. Tank Baker 17 fails its final drive inspection. The maintenance sergeant reports abnormal wear patterns on the roller bearings. They're temporary bearings, installed during training because proper bearings weren't available from supply. They need replacement before the tank deploys to combat. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison commands 2nd Battalion, 66th Armor Regiment. He submits a requisition for replacement bearings. The requisition goes to Battalion Supply. Battalion Supply checks inventory, none available. Request goes to Regiment. Regiment checks, none available. Request goes to Division. Division checks, none available. This should be impossible. The supply chain has multiple levels of redundancy specifically to prevent this exact situation. Common repair parts should be stocked at every level. Nobody should ever be unable to source basic components like roller bearings. But nobody has Type 4 heavy-duty bearings, because only 5 units exist in the entire supply system. 5 units sitting in a warehouse in Texas waiting for someone to requisition them by exact stock number and location. But nobody knows they're there. And nobody knows that 495 additional bearings simply don't exist. Major Richard Foster commands divisional supply. He's responsible for ensuring the division has everything it needs. When he learns that roller bearings aren't available at any level of supply, he initiates emergency procurement procedures. Priority requisitions go directly to Quartermaster Corps. Urgent requests for expedited delivery. The requests get received, processed, approved, forwarded to manufacturers with instructions for rush production. But even expedited production takes time. Raw materials must be sourced. Furnace time scheduled for heat treating. Precision machining requires hours per bearing. Quality inspection cannot be rushed. Minimum time from order to delivery, 8 weeks. The 2nd Armoured Division ships to North Africa on June 1st. The invasion of Sicily is scheduled for July 10th. 8 weeks from late April puts delivery sometime in late June, which barely leaves time for installation before equipment loads onto ships. Foster makes a decision: ship to North Africa with temporary bearings installed. Replace them with proper bearings when the expedited order arrives. Several months will pass between arriving in North Africa and actual combat operations. Surely enough time exists to correct this maintenance issue. Tank Baker 17 gets certified combat ready with temporary bearings. A notation goes in its maintenance log: bearings require replacement at earliest opportunity. 18 other tanks receive similar notations. Eventually, 99 tanks total are flagged as needing bearing replacement. But nobody compiles this data centrally. Each battalion tracks its own maintenance. Nobody realizes that almost half the division's Shermans share the same deficiency. The individual maintenance officers know their tanks have issues, but they assume the problem is limited to their units. Maybe particularly hard training, maybe bad luck with quality control. They have no visibility into the systemic nature of the failure. On June 1st, the 2nd Armored Division begins loading onto ships in New York. The tanks move by rail from Texas, get driven onto transport vessels, are secured in cargo holds for the Atlantic crossing. The 99 tanks with temporary bearings look identical to tanks with proper bearings during loading. They start, they drive, they function fine for low-stress operations. Nobody checks the bearings because checking isn't part of the loading checklist. The bearings are buried deep inside the final drive assembly, not visible, not accessible without major disassembly. And the tanks already passed final inspection at Fort Hood. The ships depart New York in early June, cross the Atlantic in convoy protected by destroyers, arrive at Oran, Algeria in late June, 2 weeks before the invasion of Sicily. 2 weeks seems like adequate time for any final maintenance. In reality, it's barely enough time to unload equipment, organize units, coordinate operations, and position forces for invasion. Major maintenance requiring component replacement? Nearly impossible, especially when the replacement bearings are still somewhere in the Atlantic on another cargo ship that won't arrive for at least another week. The 99 tanks will invade Sicily without the critical components they need. And the consequences will become apparent very quickly once fighting begins. Pre-dawn darkness, July 10, 1943. The invasion of Sicily begins with naval bombardment that turns night into day. Hundreds of guns from destroyers, cruisers, and battleships fire simultaneously. Shells scream overhead, impact enemy defensive positions along the beaches. The bombardment is meant to destroy fortifications, suppress defenders, create chaos. The 2nd Armored Division lands at Gela on Sicily's southern coast. Tank landing ships drive their flat bows directly onto beaches still wet from morning tide. Bow ramps drop. Sherman tanks roll off onto Sicilian soil with engines roaring and tracks churning through sand. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's battalion lands in the second wave at 3:30 in the morning. 54 tanks come ashore in 3 company groups. Form into tactical formations. Move inland according to pre-planned routes. Initial resistance is lighter than expected. Italian defensive units surrender quickly or flee. The naval bombardment was devastatingly effective. Some positions are simply abandoned, their defenders having fled during the night rather than facing Allied firepower. But German forces defending Sicily are different. Professional Wehrmacht units that will fight competently regardless of Italian collapse. And German doctrine emphasizes immediate counterattack before landing forces can establish secure beachheads. Morrison's battalion advances inland from Gela, following Highway 117 toward Piano Lupo, 6 kilometers from the beach. The highway is actually just a 2-lane paved road through agricultural land. Wheat fields, olive groves, rolling hills that offer good fields of fire but also provide concealment. At 4:47 in the morning, Tank Baker 17 experiences catastrophic bearing failure. The tank is moving at moderate speed when its right final drive assembly fails. The temporary bearing that survived training and ocean transport finally disintegrates under combat stress. The bearing fragments, the drive shaft shifts, binds against the housing, the right track stops moving while the left track keeps turning. The tank spins violently to the right, nearly flips. The driver shuts down the engine just in time. The crew evacuates according to standard procedure. Any stopped tank might be targeted by enemy fire. Get out fast, seek cover away from the vehicle. The tank cannot move under its own power. Field repair is impossible. Replacing final drive bearings requires removing the entire transmission. Work that can only be done at rear maintenance facilities with proper tools. The tank is a combat loss, even though no enemy has fired a shot at it. Morrison arrives at the breakdown location minutes later, assesses the situation. Orders Baker 17's crew to mount other tanks, radios for recovery vehicles, updates his status. 53 operational tanks instead of 54. The battalion continues advancing. At 5:23, Tank Charlie 09 fails. Same bearing problem. At 6:11, Tank Alpha 22 breaks down. By noon on July 10th, Morrison's battalion has lost 7 tanks to bearing failures without encountering enemy contact. Operational strength, 47 tanks, 87% capability, before firing a single shot. Similar reports flood in from across the division, tanks failing at rates far exceeding normal mechanical expectations. The pattern is obvious, final drive bearing failures occurring systematically. Affecting approximately 40% of Sherman tanks, Major General Harmon receives hourly updates, understands his combat power is degrading before engaging the enemy. By evening, 232 tanks landed, 38 lost to bearing failures. Effective strength, 84% of theoretical capability. But the invasion cannot stop for maintenance. German counterattacks begin materializing in the afternoon as panzer units move toward the beachheads. The battle for Sicily will be decided now. While Allied forces are vulnerable, before overwhelming combat power can be built through sustained landing operations. The first major armored engagement occurs at 5:30 that evening near Gela. Elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division encounter American tanks advancing toward Piano Lupo. About 20 German Panzer IV tanks, armed with effective 75mm guns that can penetrate Sherman armor at combat ranges. Morrison's battalion engages with 47 operational tanks. The engagement lasts 90 minutes. American tanks have advantages: numbers, rate of fire, radio communication enabling coordinated tactics. But the bearing failures create gaps in formation. Tanks that should be covering flanks are absent. Maneuvers requiring sustained high-speed movement are constrained. Commanders worry about stressing remaining bearings beyond failure point. The engagement ends with Germans withdrawing toward Piano Lupo after losing 5 Panzer IVs. Tactical American victory, but 2 more American tanks experience bearing failures during the battle. Break down mid-combat, become immobilized targets, 1 subsequently hit by German artillery and destroyed. By nightfall, Morrison's battalion has 45 operational tanks out of 54 that landed. 9 lost to bearing failures, 1 destroyed by enemy fire after being immobilized by mechanical failure. Across the division, 187 tanks operational out of 232 landed. 45 tanks lost to bearing failures in the first day. 0 lost to enemy action if you don't count tanks immobilized by mechanical failure before being hit. German commanders observing the American advance notice something unusual. American tank forces that should press attacks aggressively are moving cautiously. Units that should pursue defeated Germans are stopping to consolidate. The American armor isn't performing with expected aggressive confidence. Field Marshal Kesselring reviews reports from Sicily, notes the apparent American caution, begins planning counterattacks specifically designed to exploit this unexpected restraint. The $5 clerical error is now affecting theater-level tactical decision-making, shaping battles, influencing strategic outcomes in ways none of the participants understand. Day 2 brings intensified German counterattacks. Kesselring recognizes the critical window for defeating amphibious invasions. 48 to 72 hours, while landing forces are disorganized, supply lines vulnerable, beachhead defenses not fully established. The German plan, concentrated armor thrust directly at American beachheads. Target Gila specifically, break through to beaches, destroy landing ships, disrupt supply operations. Potentially turn the invasion into catastrophic defeat. At 6 in the morning, approximately 60 German tanks begin advancing toward Gela. 40 Panzer IVs, 20 Panzer IIIs, supported by motorized infantry and self-propelled artillery. One of the strongest German armored forces in Sicily, being committed in a single concentrated thrust. The 2nd Armored Division's positions around Gela are hasty defensive positions established overnight. Tanks deployed in company-strength positions covering main approach routes. But effective strength has been reduced by bearing failures. 45 tanks lost on day 1, additional failures overnight during repositioning. Harman's morning briefing at 5:30 provides grim statistics. Division now has 163 operational Sherman tanks out of 232 landed, 69 combat losses to bearing failures alone, 72% strength before serious combat. The German attack strikes Morrison's battalion at 6:47, with 20 Panzer IVs advancing line abreast across wheat fields. Preceded by artillery and mortar fire, German tactics emphasize speed and shock. Break through before defenders organize concentrated fire. Morrison's tanks engage from hull-down positions dug in overnight. Sherman's 75mm guns are effective at engagement ranges of 800 to 1200 meters. American crews have advantages in rate of fire and accuracy. Initial German wave loses 4 tanks in first 2 minutes. But Germans are persistent, aggressive. Panzer IVs continue advancing while firing. Their guns can penetrate Sherman armor. German tactics, aggressive maneuver to close range quickly. Accept losses during approach. Get close enough that penetration advantage matters more than American rate of fire advantage. Tank Baker 05 gets hit at 6:52 by Panzer IV round that penetrates frontal armor, detonates inside fighting compartment. Tank immediately bursts into flames as ammunition cooks off. 3 crew escape, 2 die inside. Tank Alpha 14 suffers bearing failure at 7:01 while attempting to reposition. Moving at high speed across rough ground when final drive bearing disintegrates. Right track locks. Tank stops immediately. Crew evacuates. Immobilized tank hit by German fire within minutes. Destroyed. By 7:30, the engagement is desperate close-range combat. German tanks penetrated American defensive line in several locations. Morrison's battalion fighting from fixed positions. Taking casualties. Germans maneuvering aggressively to exploit gaps created partially by bearing failures that reduced American strength before battle began. Reinforcements move forward. Tank destroyers engage from flanking positions. American artillery fires direct missions against German armor at under 2,000 meters. Naval gunfire from destroyers offshore drops shells on German assembly areas. The battle lasts until 11 in the morning. Surviving German tanks withdraw after losing 22 of 60 committed, failed to break through to beaches, but inflicted significant American casualties. Morrison's battalion ends with 31 operational tanks out of 39 operational that morning. 5 destroyed by German fire, 3 lost to bearing failures during battle, 2 of those subsequently destroyed by German fire while immobilized. Division-wide, began July 11th with 163 operational tanks. After fighting, 129 operational. 17 destroyed by enemy action, 17 lost to bearing failures during combat. The mechanical attrition rate tracks almost exactly with combat losses. For every tank knocked out by German fire, another is lost to bearing failure. Effect on combat power, cumulative. Each failed bearing reduces strength, creates gaps in formation, limits tactical flexibility, constrains commander's ability to maneuver aggressively. Harman's evening assessment. Division cannot sustain operations at current attrition rates. If bearing failures continue at 30 tanks per day, while combat adds 15 to 20 per day, the division will be combat ineffective within a week. Emergency messages go to theater logistics requesting any available bearings that might work. Maintenance crews attempt desperate field repairs. cannibalize parts from multiple failed tanks to keep some operational. But without proper replacement bearings, the 2nd Armored Division is consuming itself through mechanical failure while fighting competent enemy forces. German commanders recognize the opportunity. American armor not pressing with expected aggression, moving cautiously, conserving strength, avoiding hard driving that might stress mechanical systems, creates opportunities for stronger German defensive positions, more aggressive counterattacks. The Sicily Campaign that Allied planners expected to conclude in 2 to 3 weeks is developing into something longer and costlier. One significant factor, mechanical unreliability of substantial portion of American armor. A problem tracing back to $5 clerical error made by tired clerk who failed to press typewriter key hard enough 4 months earlier. Lieutenant Colonel David Warner commands the 2nd Armored Division's Maintenance Battalion. 41 years old, career officer, 15 years in maintenance and logistics, understands military supply systems intimately. On July 12th, Warner convenes emergency meeting in an olive grove near Gela, converted into maintenance area. 30 Sherman tanks sit disabled, awaiting repair, awaiting bearings that don't exist. Warner outlines situation with brutal honesty. Division has about 120 operational tanks remaining. 75 combat losses to bearing failures, 17 destroyed by enemy action. Mechanical attrition unsustainable, will render division combat ineffective within days. No replacement bearings arriving for at least 10 days. Theatre logistics cannot source from other units, problem unique to 2nd Armored due to procurement error. Need field expedient solutions using only resources available in Sicily. Master Sergeant Raymond Pike proposes radical solution. 23 years Army experience, 14 years working tracked vehicles. His idea, modify bearings from disabled tanks, create makeshift replacements, might provide 20 to 30 additional hours instead of 50 to 100 hours, original temporary bearings provided. But 20 hours better than 0. Requires machine shop capabilities that don't exist in forward combat areas. But Sicily supported Italian garrisons for years. Must have maintenance facilities with necessary equipment. Search parties locate Italian naval base in Gela. Maintenance shops with lathes, milling machines, precision instruments. Italian garrison fled when Allies landed. Left facilities intact. American crews occupy shops on July 13th. Restart Italian electrical systems. Test and calibrate machine tools using Italian manuals they can barely read. Modification process, crude but effective. Remove damaged bearings from catastrophically failed tanks. Machine away worst wear patterns. Reduces diameter slightly. Creates surfaces smooth enough for temporary use. Reduces structural integrity. But might provide enough operational life to keep tanks running. By July 14th, shop produces about 5 modified bearings daily. Installation crews work around the clock. Each installation requires 8 hours. Removing transmission. Replacing bearing. Reinstalling transmission. Process agonizingly slow given number of disabled tanks. But 5 tanks per day, returning to service infinitely better than 0. Private First Class. Anthony Russo is 19, from Philadelphia. Worked in father's garage since age 14. Maintenance technician performing emergency bearing installations. Working 16-hour shifts, temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. Installing final drive bearing in Sherman requires working beneath hull in cramped spaces. Precise torque settings. Careful alignment measured in thousandths of inch. Physical strength to manhandle transmission assemblies weighing several hundred pounds. Russo works alongside Corporal James Martinez from Los Angeles. They develop efficient 2-man procedure. Complete installations in 7 hours instead of 8. Time savings from working simultaneously rather than sequentially. By July 16th, emergency program returned 32 tanks to operational status, proving successful enough that Warner expands operation, commandeers additional Italian machine tools, trains more technicians. But mathematics of attrition continue working against division. 32 tanks returned to service. During same period, 41 additional tanks experienced bearing failures. Division operational strength continues declining despite heroic maintenance efforts. Modified bearings prove less durable than temporary bearings they replace. Tanks receiving modified bearings experience failures after 15 to 25 hours instead of hoped-for 30. Modifications bought time, but not enough given intensity of combat and sustained hard driving required. Harmon visits maintenance areas July 17th. Watches Russo and Martinez installing modified bearing in tank Charlie 08, working in punishing heat beneath hull while dust and diesel fumes make breathing difficult. Understands these mechanics performing miracles, but miracles insufficient to solve systemic supply failure. Harmon drafts message to 7th Army Headquarters describing crisis, requesting emergency authority to divert bearings from any other source, even if means stripping from training or non-combat vehicles. Response comes within hours. Theatre Logistics reports no compatible bearings exist anywhere in Sicily, North Africa, or Mediterranean theatre. Only bearings in system are those in transit on cargo ship, arriving in 5 days minimum. Theatre Command authorizes 2nd Armoured to take whatever measures necessary, including consolidating operational tanks into fewer units, placing tank crews without vehicles into infantry roles. But no magic solution to conjure bearings from nothing. Harmon makes decision he's been avoiding. Orders major reorganization, consolidate all operational tanks into composite battalions. Leave crews without vehicles to join infantry or provide security. Reorganization completed July 18th. Division combat power redesignated from 3 tank battalions, totaling 232 tanks, to 2 composite battalions, totaling 87 operational tanks. Mathematical reduction stark. Division now fields approximately 38% of authorized armored strength. Bearing failures cost 145 tanks over 8 days. German enemy action, maybe 25 or 30 destroyed by fire. Mechanical failure, everything else. Procurement error made 4 months earlier reduced America's elite armored division to barely 1/3 intended combat power. Sicily Campaign only 8 days old. Weeks of hard fighting still ahead. Reduction of 2nd Armored from 232 tanks to 87 operational forces. Major changes in Allied planning. Lieutenant General George Patton commands 7th Army. Based operational concept on aggressive armored thrusts, exploiting weaknesses, driving deep before Germans consolidate defenses. That concept requires substantial forces capable of sustained high-speed operations. Patton's aggressive style emphasizes speed, maneuver, accepting risk for rapid gains. But aggressive operations stress mechanical systems. Bearing crisis makes aggressive operations impossible. Patton's response demonstrates characteristic impatience with logistics. At Command Conference, July 19th, demands to know why entire armored division rendered combat ineffective by shortage of obscure mechanical component. Briefing officer attempts explaining procurement error, supply chain failure, how it happened. Patton interrupts with profanity about how modern warfare became so dependent on precise logistics that single clerk's typing error could cripple division. Demands someone fix problem immediately, including if necessary flying bearings to Sicily by priority air transport. Theatre Logistics explains air transport cannot solve problem. Bearings weigh several tons collectively. Air capacity already allocated to medical supplies and critical ammunition. Cargo ship carrying bearings still days away. Cannot be redirected or accelerated. Patton modifies operational plans accounting for reduced armored strength. Instead of aggressive thrusts deep into German positions, 2nd Armored used more conservatively as mobile reserves for consolidating gains made by infantry. Aggressive armored operations conducted by other units not suffering mechanical failures. This change has cascading effects. British forces under Montgomery advancing up eastern Sicily toward Messina. Americans under Patton through center and west. Plan assumed American armor reaches Messina first. Cuts off German escape routes, traps enemy forces in Sicily. But without full 2nd Armored combat power, American advance proceeds slower than planned. Infantry without substantial armored support encounters German defensive positions that might have been bypassed or overwhelmed by tanks, but instead require time-consuming infantry assaults. Germans recognize opportunity. Adjust defensive strategy. Instead of holding fixed positions inevitably overwhelmed by Allied numbers, conduct fighting withdrawal toward Messina. Methodical, professional, rearguards conducting aggressive actions, delaying Allied advances while main forces retreat to successive defensive lines. By late July, pattern clear. Sicily Campaign expected to conclude in 2 to 3 weeks, developing into month-long operation, consuming substantial resources and time. Germans demonstrating that even while retreating, they can inflict significant casualties and delay operations. Extended campaign has strategic implications. Allied plan called for Sicily secured quickly. Follow-on operations against mainland Italy beginning late summer. Delays in Sicily push timelines back. Italy operations likely extending into fall and winter when weather favors defenders. Extended Sicily campaign ties down forces that might be available elsewhere. Resources and attention focused on completing Sicily rather than planning subsequent operations. Delay gives Germans time to prepare mainland Italy defenses. None of these consequences attributed solely to Bering crisis. Many factors contributed: German defensive competence, terrain favoring defenders, logistical challenges, coordination difficulties. But Bering crisis was one significant factor. Illustrated how seemingly minor logistics failures have operational and strategic effects beyond immediate tactical impact. Kesselring reviewing Sicily campaign notes American armored forces not performing with expected aggressive efficiency. Tank units cautious and conservative, failing to exploit opportunities for deep penetrations, cutting off German escapes. Kesselring doesn't know about Bering crisis but correctly identifies its effects. American armor not aggressive because commanders know equipment unreliable. Cannot be risked in operations requiring sustained mechanical performance. The caution Kesselring observes, direct result of equipment deficiencies caused by $5 clerical error. August 17, 1943. Last German forces evacuate Sicily across Strait of Messina to mainland Italy. Allied campaign succeeded securing Ireland, knocking Italy out of war. Italy surrenders September 8, though Germans continue fighting. But campaign took 38 days instead of projected 14 to 21. Second Armored ended campaign with 62 operational tanks out of 232 landed July 10. During 38 days, 120 tanks lost to Bering failures, 50 to enemy action. Mechanical attrition exceeded combat losses 2-to-1 ratio. Replacement bearings finally arrive July 23, 13 days after invasion began. Cargo ship docks at Palermo. Bearings rush to maintenance units. Installation begins immediately. But replacement bearings arrive too late, affecting critical early campaign phases when aggressive armor might have shortened timeline. Bearings allow division rebuilding strength for future operations, but cannot recover opportunities lost during 5 weeks operating at reduced capability. Harman's after-action report documents Bering crisis, identifies it as major factor limiting effectiveness, recommends immediate procurement procedure review, how such shortage could occur, implement safeguards preventing similar failures. But Harman's report doesn't identify root cause, assumes complex supply chain failure, not something as simple as single keystroke error on form, typed 4 months earlier by clerk working hour 9 of 12-hour shift. Investigation tracing failure to its origin hasn't begun yet. That requires someone recognizing Bering shortage unusual enough to warrant detailed investigation, rather than accepting as another logistics failure in war where such failures are commonplace. The formal investigation, begins September 1943, 2 months after Sicily ends. Initiated not by field commanders who experience tactical consequences, but by Quartermaster Corps auditors conducting routine procurement reviews. Captain Harold Matthews reviewing expenditure reports. Year-end accounting. Notices anomaly in Second Armored Combat Loss reports. Division reports extraordinary Bering failures during Sicily. Over 100 tanks experiencing final drive failures in 6 weeks. Failure rate approximately 10 times higher than expected based on historical data. Either Second Armored subjected to unusually severe stress, or something specific to that division caused excessive failures. Matthews expands review, examines maintenance records, supply requisitions. Finds division submitted multiple emergency requisitions for Type 4 bearings starting April, describing critical shortages threatening combat readiness. Requisitions processed through expedited channels resulted in emergency production delivering replacements to Sicily late July. Emergency requisitions raise questions. Why did 2nd Armoured experience shortages when other divisions deploying had adequate supplies? All divisions should be equipped identically per standardized tables. Shortage affecting one division but not others suggests specific failure in that supply chain. Not systemic problem. Matthews pulls original procurement orders. Compares against requisitions submitted by division during Fort Hood training. Finds requisition 47,829, dated March 10th, requesting 500 Type 4 bearings. Then finds procurement order generated from that requisition. Form he personally reviewed and approved March 15th. Lists 5 units instead of 500. Quantity discrepancy jumps out immediately once Matthews specifically looking. Handwritten requisition clearly shows 500 units. Typed procurement order reads 5 units. Error obvious in hindsight. Clerk mistyped quantity, reducing by factor of 100. Error small enough not appearing obviously wrong during cursory review. Some line items call for quantities of 5 or fewer for specialized items. But this error had catastrophic consequences, component critical to tank operations. No backup supplies when shortage became apparent. Matthews immediately expands investigation. Identifies who typed order, how error occurred. Procurement order bears Margaret Sullivan's clerk identification stamp. Matthews reviews her personnel file, work history, rated competent. Error rates within acceptable norms, nothing suggesting she's particularly prone to errors or requiring special oversight. Matthews pulls all other orders Sullivan typed during March, reviews for similar errors, finds approximately 12 errors in roughly 4,000 line items typed that month. Error rate 0.3%. Well within acceptable standards, most errors caught and corrected during review. Bearing quantity error slipped through, not obviously wrong enough triggering scrutiny. Investigation report documents error chain with bureaucratic precision. Clerk mistyped quantity. Reviewing officer failed catching error during cursory review. Manufacturing company fulfilled order as written without questioning unusually small quantity. Supply personnel accepted delivery without comparing against requirement generating order. Error propagated through multiple checkpoints that should have caught it, but didn't, because no single person had complete information context, making discrepancy obvious. Matthews's recommendations preventing similar failures require quantity verification on procurement orders exceeding value thresholds. Implement cross-checking where multiple clerks review each other's work. Create systemic reviews comparing requisitions against filled orders, identifying discrepancies. Train reviewing officers specifically scrutinizing quantity fields on high-value orders. All sensible, all too late for 2nd Armoured during Sicily. Investigation report moves up Quartermaster Corps chain of command. Senior officers review with varying concern. Some focus on procedural improvements needed. Others on how fragile military logistics are if single keystroke cripples entire division. But nobody particularly interested in assigning individual blame. Sullivan made error, but error rates in typing thousands of line items daily statistically inevitable. Matthews failed catching during review, but expecting reviewing officers catching every error on every form, unrealistic given volume. Manufacturing fulfilled order as written. That's what manufacturers supposed to do. Failure systemic rather than individual. Logistics system lacked adequate redundancy catching errors before propagating into operational failures. Systemic fragility the real problem, not specific individuals whose actions contributed to this failure. Sullivan learns about investigation October. Matthews calls her into office. Private conversation. Explains error she made March contributed to equipment shortages affecting Sicily combat operations. Doesn't provide details about tactical consequences or casualties potentially affected. Simply informs she made error with significant consequences. Procedures being changed preventing similar errors. Sullivan, 23 years old. Military clerk, 8 months. No framework for processing that typing error had combat consequences. Asks Matthews directly whether soldiers died because of her mistake. Matthews doesn't know. Investigation focused on logistics and procedures, not combat outcomes. Tells her honestly he doesn't know. That uncertainty haunts Sullivan for decades, never knows exactly what her error cost. Only that it cost something significant enough, warranting formal investigation and procedural changes. Ambiguity perhaps worse than knowing specific consequences. Can imagine worst-case scenarios without facts constraining imagination. Sullivan continues as procurement clerk another 2 years until war ends. Work performance remains competent. Error rates within acceptable standards. Never makes another error with significant consequences. But knowledge of that one critical error creates anxiety affecting her work for years. After war, Sullivan marries, becomes Margaret Dawson, settles in Atlanta, works various administrative jobs, raises 3 children, never speaks about wartime service except general terms. When children ask what she did during war, simply says worked in office processing military paperwork. Never tells them about $5 error. Never explains sometimes in war, victory or defeat turns on something as trivial and random as tired clerk, failing to press typewriter key hard enough during hour 9 of 12-hour shift processing orders, affecting thousands of lives she would never meet. National World War II Museum in New Orleans, special exhibit open 2018. Title: Victory's Details, How Logistics Won the War. One display case contains procurement order 47,829, March 15, 1943. Line item 47 visible, 5 units typed where 500 should appear. Next to form, Type 4 heavy-duty roller bearing, recovered from Sherman that fought Sicily. Once displayed at Army Ordnance Museum, transferred to World War II Museum. Display caption reads, "The $5 mistake, how single typing error extended Sicily Campaign, costing thousands of casualties." Procurement form typed by Clerk Margaret Sullivan at Fort Benning, Georgia. March 15, 1943. Quantity error on line 47 resulted in only 5 roller bearings manufactured instead of 500. Left 99 Sherman tanks without critical components during Sicily invasion. Demonstrates how modern warfare depends on precise logistics, where small failures have catastrophic consequences. Museum visitors stop at display, read caption with expressions ranging from disbelief to recognition. Some immediately understand how such error happens. Anyone working in complex administrative systems recognizes how mistakes propagate when many people processing large transaction volumes under time pressure. Others struggle accepting something as significant as military campaign, affected by typing error. Exhibit doesn't include Sullivan photographs, doesn't mention her name beyond caption, doesn't describe her personal life or thoughts about error. Those details remain private, known only to family and few researchers studying incident in detail. Exhibit focuses instead on systemic issues error illustrates. Fragility of complex logistic systems. Importance of verification procedures. Ways small failures cascade into large consequences. Uses specific incident illuminating larger truths about modern warfare and organizational complexity. Educational groups visiting museum use bearing crisis as teaching example. Students write papers analyzing what went wrong. How similar failures might be prevented. Business schools use incident as supply chain management case study. Military officers studying logistics examine incident identifying lessons applicable to contemporary operations. Sherman tank displayed near procurement form is serial number 3,047,829. One of tanks that fought Sicily with defective bearings. Eventually repaired, served through rest of war. Retired to museum storage, 1952. Painted in olive drab scheme used during Sicily. 2nd Armored Division markings visible on turret. Tank shows combat wear. Scars from German machine gun fire. Patches where armor repaired after being penetrated. Replacement track sections installed after originals wore out. But tank also represents successful maintenance and repair. Proof that even seriously damaged equipment could be restored through skilled work and adequate spare parts supply. Display doesn't show final drive assembly where defective bearing would be installed. That component buried deep within hull, invisible to visitors. But bearing displayed separately represents all hidden components that had to work correctly for visible tank functioning in combat. Exhibit viewed by approximately 300,000 visitors since opening. Most spend 2 to 3 minutes before moving to more dramatic exhibits. D-Day invasion, Pacific island hopping, strategic bombing. But some linger longer, recognizing in $5 error story something resonating with their own organizational experience. Understanding intuitively that complex systems fail exactly this way. Through accumulation of small errors, individually seeming insignificant but collectively creating catastrophic consequences. Teachers bringing school groups use bearing crisis illustrating lessons about attention to detail. Importance of seemingly mundane tasks. Explain to students that history isn't made only by famous generals and political leaders, also by ordinary people doing routine work, with consequences they may never fully understand. Veterans who served Iraq and Afghanistan visit exhibit. Recognize supply chain challenges they experienced during deployments. Remember waiting weeks or months for critical parts while equipment sat broken. Missions compromised by maintenance issues. Bearing crisis from 1943 resonates with 21st century warfare experiences where logistics remain crucial and failures remain common. Museum Gift Shop sells books about World War II logistics, including Dr. Robert Palmer's Logistics Failures in American Military During World War II. Doesn't sell large quantities. Most visitors prefer dramatic battle accounts and heroes. But book finds steady readership among military professionals, business school students, history buffs interested in aspects beyond combat. Margaret Sullivan Dawson's grandchildren visited Museum 2019, saw their grandmother's error displayed as historical artifact, experienced complicated emotions, pride that grandmother's work considered historically significant, but discomfort seeing error presented as cautionary example. They left note in museum comment book, "Margaret Sullivan was our grandmother, good person who worked hard and tried her best during difficult circumstances. Error she made haunted her for rest of life, but never let it stop her from continuing to serve and contribute." We hope visitors remember that behind every case study and historical incident are real human beings doing their best in impossible situations. Museum director read note. Had it framed and placed near exhibit. Reminder that history made by people, not abstract forces or inevitable trends. Every event, every decision, every consequence involves individual human beings with lives and families and futures extending beyond specific moments history remembers. $5 error remains teaching example, cautionary tale, illustration of system fragility, but also reminder that history made by ordinary people performing ordinary tasks. People like Margaret Sullivan, 23-year-old clerk who pressed typewriter key insufficiently hard during hour 9 of 12-hour shift, thereby changing World War II course in ways she would never fully understand. War ended, soldiers went home, tanks retired to museums, procurement forms filed in archives. Lessons learned from $5 error continue influencing how modern organizations think about quality control, verification procedures, hidden vulnerabilities in complex systems turning small mistakes into catastrophic failures. Here is what we know for certain. March 15, 1943. 1 typing error. April through June. System failure to catch that error. July 10th through August 17th. 38-day campaign instead of planned 14 to 21. Total American casualties, Sicily Campaign, approximately 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing. How many of those 7,000 because campaign extended by reduced armored capability? How many because 2nd Armored Division couldn't perform as planned? How many because tanks broke down when they should have been fighting? Nobody knows exact number. Too many variables, too many factors. War is complex, outcomes determined by thousands of decisions and accidents, and random chances all interacting in ways impossible to separate and measure. But we know this: the bearing shortage mattered. It reduced American combat power. It constrained tactical options. It extended the campaign. It cost lives. How many lives? 1? 100? 1,000? Margaret Sullivan died 1987 never knowing, carried that uncertainty to her grave, the burden of not knowing whether her tired fingers on that March morning cost one life or many. Whether soldiers died because she was too exhausted to press a key correctly. Maybe that uncertainty was mercy. Maybe knowing would have been worse, or maybe knowing would have helped, would have allowed her to process and accept and move forward. Instead of carrying ambiguous guilt for 44 years until death ended the wondering, we tell ourselves that war is about great leaders making strategic decisions, brilliant generals winning battles through tactical genius, heroes performing extraordinary acts of courage under fire, and war is those things. History remembers Patton and Eisenhower and the countless soldiers who fought and died. Remembers D-Day and Stalingrad and Midway and all the famous battles where nations' fates were decided. But war is also Margaret Sullivan at her typewriter, tired, working too many hours, processing too much paperwork, making one small mistake in one line item on one form among thousands. Not because she was careless, not because she didn't care, but because she was human. And humans make mistakes, especially when exhausted and overwhelmed and trying their best, but falling short because perfection is impossible when you're processing 15,000 words per day in 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. The $5 mistake changed World War II. Extended Sicily Campaign, cost American lives, influenced strategic outcomes. But it also reminds us that history is not made only by great people doing great things. History is made by ordinary people doing ordinary things with consequences they cannot predict or control. A clerk types. A key doesn't press fully. A zero disappears. 4 months later, tanks break down on battlefields in Sicily. Cause and effect, separated by time and space and layers of organizational complexity. Connected by invisible threads nobody can see until something goes wrong, and investigators trace the failure backward through procurement systems and supply chains and mechanical systems until arriving at that one moment. That one keystroke, that one tired finger failing to press hard enough. This is war. This is logistics. This is human error and systemic failure and the brutal mathematics of modern warfare, where victory requires not just brave soldiers and good generals, but also millions of ordinary people performing millions of ordinary tasks with sufficient accuracy that armies stay supplied and equipment stays functional and soldiers have what they need to stay alive. And sometimes those ordinary people fail, not through malice, not through negligence, just through being human and making mistakes and falling short of perfection, because perfection is impossible when you're tired and overwhelmed and trying your best, but it's not quite good enough. Margaret Sullivan made a mistake. The system failed to catch it. 99 tanks went to war without proper parts. The Sicily campaign lasted longer than planned. Lives were lost. These facts are connected. But the connection is not simple causation. It's complex, probabilistic, uncertain. Because war is chaos where thousands of factors interact in ways nobody fully understands. We remember the $5 mistake because it illustrates larger truth. In modern warfare, in modern organizations, in modern life, small failures can have enormous consequences when they cascade through complex systems. We remember it as warning, as lesson, as reminder that details matter, that verification matters, that building redundancy into systems matters, that protecting people from exhaustion and overwork matters. We remember Margaret Sullivan not as villain who cost lives through negligence, but as ordinary person doing ordinary work who made ordinary mistake with extraordinary consequences. We remember that behind every statistic, every casualty number, every campaign that lasted too long and cost too much, there are human beings, soldiers who died, families who grieved, and also clerks who made errors, officers who missed mistakes, systems that failed to catch problems, all of them human, all of them trying, all of them part of vast machinery of war that consumed lives and resources and futures with mechanical indifference to individual intentions or desires or efforts. This is the story of the $5 mistake. This is the story of how 1 0 disappeared from one line on one form. This is the story of Margaret Sullivan and 99 Sherman tanks and thousands of soldiers and a campaign that lasted too long. This is the story of how small mistakes become big consequences in complex systems where everything connects to everything else, in ways nobody fully understands until something goes catastrophically wrong and reveals the hidden connections that were always there, but invisible until failure made them obvious. Remember this story. Remember that details matter. Remember that people who make mistakes aren't necessarily careless or negligent or malicious. Remember that in complex systems, small failures can have enormous consequences. Remember that war is decided not only on battlefields, but in offices and factories and supply depots where ordinary people do ordinary work that sometimes fails in extraordinary ways. Remember Margaret Sullivan. Remember the $5 mistake. Remember